Texas rig. What does the Texas rig comprise of? A weedless hook, a bead, a Texas weight or an egg sinker, and the option of a bobber stopper or not. To this rig we thread our chosen lure on to the weedless hook, which in this case I've removed the barb from because we always advise that. Now to do that, you place the hook point in the center of the head of the bait, looking at the length of your hook keeper section here. Put your hook in roughly that deep, pull it out of the belly of the bait, thread the bait up and over the hook keeper section. Lay the lure alongside the hook, mark where you'll find where the hook would go through the lure, and push through the middle of the bait, thus Texas rigging your bait. Excuse the lead sliding around. The next step is to either sit it in the recess that happens to be in some baits, so you're pretty weedless there, or to expose the bait, so burying the hook point into the bait, which you do by pulling the plastic towards the eye of the bait and dropping it onto the hook point, and there you can see you have a totally weedless bait. Now without it pegged, you can see the lead moves. So if you imagine the lead's on the bottom and the fish grabs the lure, it can pull. There's less resistance there. If you peg the lure, obviously they'll feel the weight quicker, but there are occasions when you want to use the Texas rig in really rough ground and you don't want your, if I pull this apart again, you don't want your bait up here and your weight hung up 3 or 4 feet away on something else and neither reaching the bottom. So that is the occasion that I would use a pegged Texas rig. And now we have several options with this. We don't have to use an EWG hook, we could use a weedless worm hook, we could use a different variety of weights, we could use tungsten weights, which are the best weights but very expensive, but you get the most feel from. You'll feel the bottom more through a tungsten weight than you will a lead weight. You can also use a brass weight, which will give you a different sound, and some say the best sound, against the bead, because this clanking of the bead and the weight against each other is what very often can trigger a bite or a response from a fish. Wrasse are very inquisitive and will go find that sound or be made aware of that sound and then notice the lure and go and have a go at the lure. Now what happens when the fish bites? When the fish bites, the bait collapses down, exposing the hook point. You'll feel it, you'll set the hook. So there you have it. That is the Texas rig. So moving on from the Texas rig, which we have below us here with the bobber stop above, which is optional, we can use a Carolina rig. Now a Carolina rig, or the one I have here, if you see, I have 2 bobber stops trapping the bead and the weight, and a bobber stop above. I usually distance that a little because you still get the clacking effects of the sound from the bead and the weight hitting. Now a Carolina rig detaches the lure from the weight, so a bonus with that is your lure acts more natural, especially on the fall, because your weight will hit the bottom followed by your lure, which will sink slowly and more naturally, and sometimes that's a presentation that can really turn the fish on. You can, with this adjustable Carolina rig, you can set the length of your trace, thus increasing the time your lure spends to sink and fishing at different depths. Whereas with a Texas rig, your weight's pretty much going to go down and the lure follow it. There might be a bit of slack here, but you're dictating the fall, or the time it takes for the bait to fall, with the length of your trace of the Carolina rig. Obviously the longer you make it, the more tangles you're going to get. I suggest stopping the whole thing just before it hits the water, which will straighten it out. That helps with tangles. If you're getting tangles with this, which I don't seem to, all you do is replace these 2 bobber stops with a swivel. Now why would we use it and where would we use it? I don't use it in the thickest of cover. I use it in clean to broken ground, fishing around rocks, but beside structure, where the ground is clear enough for me to present this rig. It looks as though it's as weedless as a Texas rig, but the Texas rig is in fact more weedless. It's not bad, and the benefit of this is if you're fishing with this trace, you can present a bait up alongside a rock face or some other form of structure, a weed line. And if you were a diver and you had a look and went down and saw where wrasse are, they're not always banged down on the deck. Very often they're holed up in little holes and things like that under ledges in a reef. So it's a way of presenting a bait off the bottom by using a floating bait of some description, either brought off the shelf or with a tube, a bit of foam inserted in here. So the Jika Rig. Well, the Jika Rig comprises of your weedless hook, 1 or 2 split rings. In this case I put 2 split rings together. Your hook is placed onto a split ring and your weight, in this case, placed onto a separate split ring. In this instance it is a gnarly bomb with a swivel, which I find very good, help with tangles. You could just have 1 split ring and a drop shot weight that you've opened up, but if I show you what I've found the problem to be with this is you don't have as much movement as you do with 2 clips. This hook can go all over the place. Another option I've been playing with of late is to use a breakaway clip with the weight, which I prefer to be an arsely bomb here, or a swiveled weight of some description, placed in the end of the clip, and the hook the same. This seems to fit through the eye of the hook quite nicely on a standard EWG hook. These are the Snowbie hooks, although you can buy hooks with bigger eyes. Just make sure for wrasse they're heavier gauge. For other species it's not so important, but as you can see, that's quite neat. You can assemble it, disassemble it easily on the bank, and you can take all of this off, change the size of your hook, size of your weight very easily. You could also remove it all and clip on a plug if you wanted to have a go at bass on the day. So it's a very versatile setup. I haven't used it that much, just the 1 trip so far. Everything seemed good, but yeah, something to play around with there. Why do we use Jika rigs? Well, Jika rigs present our bait more horizontally. They keep our weight with our bait, which is good in some scenarios, such as fishing in very deep water, into deep tall rack or weed, where you don't want your weight to separate from your bait as it might in an unpegged Texas rig. The horizontal way that the bait sits off of the Jika rig is a more natural presentation. You can also vary your line ties. If you're just dragging along the bottom, it's not going to matter too much. You can tie to the end here. If you're fishing deeper water, I tend to tie at the top here, and the reason I do that is because you can influence the bait more and tap this weight on the bottom a little easier. So there's the Jika rig. The Cheb rig. The Cheb rig comprises of a weight, a clip which sits inside the weight, your hook with a weedlessly rigged lure. So if you can see the assembled weight here, it's quite small, that one. The wire sits through the middle of the weight, and you want your hook to be sat on this upturned section of wire, not at this end. This is where you tie your line. So if we try and assemble this now, turn your bait upside down, pass onto the wire, over the back and flip it over, and now you'll see it's facing upwards the correct way. Squeeze the parts of the clip together, push into the widest end of the slot if they are different, push through, and there you have it. Now you can tie directly onto here. You could put this on a clip, then you can change out easier. I prefer to keep things simple and just tie direct like this. If you can see, you can use a variety of lures, any lures you choose, to be honest. Some better than others. Paddle tails, tubes, great for this. crawls, excellent for it. What you basically created is an articulated jig head with lots of movement for your bait. It's a quick change rig, it's a versatile rig. It is not as snag proof as your Texas rigs or other rigs, but it is a really good rig all the same. An important thing to remember when wrasse fishing is the cheb that you use. The wire inside the cheb needs to be thick. I think you can, just by doing that, you can clearly see the difference in gauge of wire. We found with finer wired, maybe cheaper chebs, this wire will bend out with wrasse, whereas this cheb, which unfortunately I can't remember where I sourced from, has nice thick wire and won't bend out. Next is the Neko Rig. What is the Neko Rig? I'm sure lots of you already know. You basically have a weight in one end of the worm, Senko, whatever bait you want to use, and to that you attach a hook, usually about a third of the way to halfway up the bait, and attach that to your leader. What this does is makes the head of the bait weighty, so that when you pull on the line it bounces the lure around and it gives a very natural look to the worm. The top of the worm will stand upright and flop around as though some sort of worm trying to get back into the bottom, I guess. There are several hooks that you can use. Obviously when we're wrasse fishing, we're fishing in amongst or alongside. That's where I would use it, alongside. Rock faces, weed lines, that kind of thing. Not in the real thick of it, you're going to lose too many. But we need some sort of weedless hook. I have two versions here. This setup I put on a trick worm, a wave worm trick worm, one of my favourites these. And if you can see, it has a hook with a little weed guard. It's basically a big wacky rig hook that they've made weedless by putting two bits of stiff nylon there to make it as weedless as possible. To the bottom of that is a nail weight. If I unscrew this a bit, you'll see what I mean. You can buy these, and they're basically weights like such, which you push in, screw in to the head of your bait. Quite simply done. As you can see with this one, I've just hooked it through a portion of the worm, and make sure you hook upwards so the point of your hook is facing upwards as such. Trick worms are excellent for this because usually they have a floating bulbous tail, helps it stand up, and I find this particularly effective in the winter when fish aren't wanting to move as much. You can shake, bounce this around in front of their faces and they'll tend to have it, this trick worm in particular. The other option I've got on here is a cheaper option. So instead of a nail weight, I've just got a screw, which I've just screwed into the end to give me the weighting I want. I'd suggest you use stubbier screws, thicker stubbier screws, or screws to suit the bait that you're using, slim or wider profile. So this is a wider profile bait than our trick worm. This is one of my favourite Senkos, and if you see what I've done there is I put an O-ring on it. You can buy these in the shops all over the place. You can buy different sizes to fit different worms. And what this does is, instead of hooking so much into the plastic of the worm, which you can still do if you wish, you can hook just under the O-ring like that, and it saves your worms. You don't lose so many worms on the strike. You still get to keep your worm most of the time. They don't rip as easily as with the hook just in there with the trick worm. What you'll also notice is, this is something I'm experimenting with at the moment. These were off AliExpress. They are weedless worm hooks, and basically what they have is a wire guide which you depress, put over the point of the hook, makes the hook weedless. When the fish bites, it depresses that, freeing up the hook point, which you then set in its mouth. Now I would prefer a wider gate one than this, and I'm sure some of you perch guys will suggest some to me, or possibly even make some of my own up on a similar principle with this, with a couple bits of fluorocarbon. So there's your Neko Rig. Don't use it in the thick stuff, use it along the edges, around rocks, use it to sight fish, use it in the winter. Cheers. Next we have the Splitshot rig. As you can see, this is probably the simplest rig you can tie. Tie your line direct to your lure, pop a Splitshot on the line. The Splitshot can be placed anywhere on your line. It's a real finessey rig. I once had my arse handed to me by a youngster fishing exactly like this when I was using Texas rigs for wrasse. He was catching, I wasn't. I switched to this very finessey rig. I started to catch. You can, as I said, move the Splitshot closer or further away from your lure. The closer you move it to the lure, the less freedom your lure has, but the more sensitivity you have to bites. It's what we call a telltale shot. Another aspect of the rig is this Splitshot will catch in things as you're pulling it in. It's coming into contact with reed rack in the bottom, and it will kick your lure off at different angles, and sometimes that can attract the fish. Also, if it becomes snagged, it's usually possible that it will come off. So last in this rig series, because it is the rig I use the least, is the Dropshot rig. I'm probably talking to the converted already here, but as you can see with this, in this instance I have an EWG hook attached to a piece of wire that has had an eye put on either end, so that the hook can be tied on the bank directly to your rod on your leader, and another piece added to your weight. Now, why the Dropshot rig? Why would we use the Dropshot rig? It's an adjustable rig. We can adjust the distance between the weight and the hook, therefore adjusting the distance your lure is from the bottom. So you can fish anything from inches is here, which works, to 3-4 foot off the bottom if you want, or more. It depends on the depth of water you're fishing in and whereabouts in that column of water that the fish are sitting. In this case we have a weedless EWG hook. You'll struggle sourcing these, so there are alternatives to this. You can use a polymer knot to put this EWG hook on. I'm sure some of you do. Or there is a knot which I prefer when fishing in freshwater called the Japanese Dropshot knot. Either of those work. This is just a convenient thing for me when I'm wrasse fishing. I can keep these in a packet, tie up in no time, rather than messing around with knots on the rocks. So retrieves, you can drag along the bottom, stop and shake. There's one. You can hop it along the bottom, up and down, and shake. Or as I very often do, is fish a semi-slack line, as I call it, and tap the slack, which won't move the weight but will move the line and get your lure to act very natural.